A man you know is rich. Not comfortable. Rich. He has the car, the watch, the number in his account that makes other men go quiet when they hear it. And he is one of the loneliest, most anxious men you have ever met. You have seen this before. You have felt the confusion of it. How does a man have everything, and still flinch every time his phone buzzes with a bank notification? Money did not make him free. Money made him watched. Watched by himself, every hour, checking whether the number is still there. By the end of the next 40 minutes, you will understand why. And you will understand something more dangerous. The same trap is already closing around you, whether you have money or not. What follows are 10 laws the Stoics left behind, buried in writing meant for men who lived 2,000 years before you were born. Law 1. Money is not the scoreboard for your worth. You think the problem is not having enough. It is not. The problem is what you quietly decided money means. Somewhere, without ever saying it out loud, you decided your number is your worth. That the size of your account is the size of your value as a man. Nobody sat you down and taught you this. Nobody had to. You absorbed it. From the comparisons. From the silence in a room when someone mentions what they earn. From the specific shame of being the one who has less. And once money becomes the scoreboard for your worth, you stop spending it. You start feeding it. Feeding a wound that money was never built to heal. This is the first thing Stoicism strips away from you. Not your money. Your delusion about what it was ever for. Law 2. You can lose everything and still be someone. 23 centuries ago, a merchant named Zeno of Citium loaded a cargo of purple dye onto a ship bound for Athens. Somewhere in open water, the ship went down. Zeno washed up with nothing. No cargo. No fortune. No plan. Most men would call that the end of a story. For Zeno, it was the beginning of one. Wandering into Athens with nothing to his name, he stopped in a bookshop and overheard a passage being read aloud, something about virtue and the good life. He asked the shopkeeper where he could find a man who taught like that. As it happened, the philosopher himself was walking by at that exact moment. The shopkeeper pointed. Zeno followed him, and never really stopped following that question for the rest of his life. Within a few years he was teaching under a public colonnade in Athens called the Stoa, the painted porch, and the students who gathered there took their name from the building. Stoics. A word that started as nothing more than an address. Here is what almost nobody tells you about that story. Zeno did not build a philosophy of indifference to wealth because he was born poor and comfortable with it. He built it because he lost everything he had, and discovered underneath the wreckage that he was still, undeniably, someone. That discovery is the entire foundation of everything you are about to hear. You do not need a shipwreck to run this same test on yourself. You have already run smaller versions of it and probably did not notice. The job that ended without warning. The market crash that erased a decade of savings in a single quarter. The business that failed after years of your life poured into it. In each of those moments, for a few days, you were forced to ask the same question Zeno asked on that beach in Athens. Who am I, underneath the number? Most men answer that question in a panic and then spend the rest of their lives trying to forget they were ever asked it. Zeno answered it once, honestly, and built a philosophy so durable it is still being taught to you, right now, by a stranger's voice coming out of a small screen in your pocket. Law 3. The wealthy man is not the one who has much. He is the one who needs little. Say that again in your head. Sit with how much it contradicts everything you have been sold. Marcus Aurelius ruled an empire that stretched from the fog of Britain to the deserts past the Euphrates. He could have owned anything a man could want. Palaces, silver, armies that existed purely to make other men flinch at the sound of his name. He did not become the man history remembers because of any of that. He became that man because of a teacher named Junius Rusticus, who, when Marcus was still young, handed him a set of notes on the teachings of a long-dead former slave named Epictetus. Marcus read them and never fully put them down again. Years later, ruling from the frontier, fighting wars he never wanted, burying children he had loved, he kept a private journal. Not for an audience. Not for history. For himself, alone, some nights by candlelight, trying to talk his own mind back into order before sleep. He never gave it a title. We call it meditations now, and it was never meant to be read by you or me at all. That is precisely why it tells the truth. In those pages, he kept returning to an idea the Stoics called the indifference. Wealth, reputation, possessions, even health, he told himself, are not what make a man good or bad. They are simply outside the things that actually define him. Not because they do not matter at all, but because they are not where a man's worth lies. Picture that for a moment. The most powerful man on earth, lying awake in a tent on some cold frontier, reminding himself that none of it, none of the armies or the gold or the titles, counted toward who he really was. Marcus had another private exercise, one he returned to constantly in those same notebooks. He called it, roughly translated, the view from above. He would imagine his mind rising up out of his own body, above the palace, above Rome, above the whole curve of the earth, until every army he commanded and every treasury he controlled shrank down to the size of insects arguing over crumbs. From that height, a fortune that felt enormous at ground level became almost impossible to even locate. He paired that exercise with another one that should sound almost brutal to modern ears. He reminded himself, deliberately, often, that he would die. Not as a morbid indulgence, but as a filter. If a worry could not survive being held up against the fact that his life was finite and already shortening by the hour, it was not worth the space it was taking up in his mind. Try running your own financial anxiety through that same filter for a moment. The number in your account, the car you have not bought yet, the way a stranger might silently judge your salary. Hold all of it up against the plain fact that you will die, and notice how much of it simply stops mattering. You were taught the opposite of all of this. You were taught to chase the external and call it success. Think about the last thing you bought to prove a point. Not because you needed it. Because you needed someone to see it. That watch on your wrist was never about telling time. It was about someone else wanting to be you. This is the first crack in the foundation. Every financial anxiety you carry was built on top of it. If you have ever bought something you could not afford just to be seen a certain way, type ICIT in the comments right now. Not for me. For you. So that 6 months from now, when this video finds you again, you remember the exact moment you admitted it. Law 4. Control what is yours. Release what is not. Before Marcus was born, before he ever wore a crown, a man named Epictetus was living in Rome as another man's property. Owned by a wealthy freedman named Epictetus, he was, by most accounts, physically abused during his years in bondage, which is likely why he walked with a limp for the rest of his life. He owned nothing. Not his body. Not his time. Not his name. And yet this man, who had less than almost anyone who will ever watch this video, eventually earned his freedom, opened a school in Nicopolis, and taught something that self-made billionaires still fail to grasp. He divided the entire world into two categories. What is in your control? What is not? The market is not in your control. Other men's spending is not in your control. The inheritance you did or did not receive is not in your control. Your discipline is. Your effort is. Your reaction to loss is. Entirely, completely yours. Picture two men who lose the same amount of money in the same afternoon. One spends the night replaying every decision that led there, cursing the market, cursing his luck, cursing himself. The other spends that same night asking a single, quieter question. What is still mine to do about this tomorrow morning? Same loss. Two completely different men by sunrise. You thought the anxiety was about the money. It was never about the money. It was about trying to control what was never yours to control. The moment you stop fighting the market and start mastering your reaction to it, money stops owning you. Nobody handed you this dichotomy when you were young. What you were handed instead was silence, or its opposite, tension, every time money came up at your own dinner table. Maybe you watched a parent's face change when a bill arrived. Maybe you learned, without a single word being said, that money was the thing adults fought about after the children were supposed to be asleep. Maybe you learned the reverse, that money was never discussed at all, which taught you just as much, because a subject a family refuses to name is usually the subject that family fears the most. Whatever you inherited it before you were old enough to question it, which means you have likely spent your entire adult life executing a financial philosophy you never actually chose. You just absorbed it, the way a plant absorbs whatever is in the soil it happens to grow in, and called the result your own personality. This is worth sitting with longer than a single sentence allows. The anxious way you check your balance. The way you flinch at your own spending, or overcorrect by never allowing yourself anything at all. Some real portion of that was installed in you before you had any say in the matter. The Stoics would not ask you to blame the household that installed it. They would ask you a harder question. Now that you can see it, what are you going to keep, and what are you finally going to put down? Law 5. Freedom is the shrinking of need. Here is a sentence that should unsettle you. The man who needs a great deal to feel content has made himself a servant. Not to another man. To his own appetite. Epictetus said it plainly, in words that survive to this day through the notes of his student Arian. Freedom is not the absence of need. Freedom is the shrinking of it. You do not need the second car. You do not need the upgrade. You do not need the version of your life that requires 40 extra hours a week to maintain a lifestyle built to impress people who were never really watching. Here is what that lifestyle actually costs you, if you let yourself see it clearly. It costs your evenings. It costs your sleep. It costs the version of you that used to laugh easily, before every conversation quietly became about money. Earning it. Protecting it. Comparing it. Picture a man at a dinner table, phone face down beside his plate, laughing at something his wife just said. Then the phone lights up. A single notification. He does not even pick it up. He does not have to. The laugh is already gone from his face. Now picture a different man, in a smaller apartment, with a smaller car, and an evening that belongs entirely to the people sitting across from him. He is not richer. On paper, he has less. But he owns his own attention, and that is a kind of wealth the first man gave up years ago without ever noticing the transaction. You lose the ease first. You only notice it is gone later, in some quiet moment, when you realize you cannot remember the last time money did not sit somewhere in the back of your mind. This is not weakness. It is what happens to any man who lets an external thing decide his internal state. It happened to emperors. It will happen to you, unless something changes today. Here is how it usually happens. in case you have not noticed it happening to you already. A man gets a raise. For a few weeks, it feels exactly like he imagined it would. Then, slowly, without any single decision he could point back to, his spending rises to meet it. A better car, because he can technically afford the payment now. A bigger apartment, because the old one suddenly feels beneath him. Small upgrades, one after another, each one reasonable on its own, each one justified by the new number on his paycheck. A year later he is earning significantly more than he was, and he is no less anxious about money than he was before the raise. In some ways he is more anxious, because now there is more to lose, more payments that assume the good months keep coming, more of his identity quietly wired into a number that could move in either direction at any time. He built a bigger house on the exact same foundation of insecurity, and then wondered why it still did not feel like enough. This is not a story about bad decisions. Every individual choice in that story was rational. It is a story about a baseline that keeps moving just out of reach, no matter how fast a man runs toward it. The Stoics do not tell you to refuse the raise. They tell you to notice the moving baseline, name it out loud, and decide, deliberately, how much of your life you are willing to hand over chasing it further. Law 6. Integrity cannot be bought. There is another Roman worth knowing here, a senator named Cato the Younger. Cato was, by every account from his own time, a man who could not be bought. Bribes were offered to him routinely, the way they were offered to every man in his position. He refused them all, not quietly, but publicly, in a way designed to remind everyone watching that his integrity was not for sale at any price they could name. He lived simply by choice while men far less capable than him lived in marble houses funded by corruption. When the political order he had spent his life defending finally collapsed around him, he chose to end his own life rather than accept a pardon from the man who destroyed the republic he believed in. Whatever you think of that final choice, the man who made it had spent decades proving, in full public view, that his sense of himself did not come from his bank balance, his popularity, or his safety. It came from somewhere the world could not reach. You do not need Cato's ending to learn Cato's lesson. You only need to ask yourself, honestly, whether there is a version of you that could be bought. And if the answer makes you uncomfortable, sit with that discomfort instead of running from it. That discomfort is information. You will likely never be offered a bribe in the dramatic sense Cato faced them. Your version will be quieter. The client who wants you to cut a corner in exchange for a bigger contract. The job that pays considerably more but asks you to become someone you would not recognize in 5 years. The opportunity that only works if you stop asking the questions that are making everyone else in the room uncomfortable. Cato's test was public and historic. Yours will happen in a private meeting nobody else will ever hear about, and only you will know which way you decided. Law 7. Rehearse losing it, so it can never own you. Seneca was one of the richest men in Rome, and his critics never let him forget it. How could a man teach indifference to wealth while living inside more of it than almost anyone alive? Here is what they missed. Seneca was not trying to be poor. He was training to survive being poor, so that wealth could never again hold a knife to his throat. He had good reason to train for it. Early in his career, he was exiled to the island of Corsica on trumped-up charges, stripped of his position, his property, and nearly everything he had built. Years later, he clawed his way back to Rome and to wealth. And near the end of his life, when the Emperor Nero, his own former student, turned against him, Seneca offered to give back his entire fortune in exchange for being left alone to live out his days in peace. Nero refused the offer and, not long after, ordered Seneca to take his own life. Seneca did so with what witnesses described as remarkable composure, dictating his final words to friends gathered around him. That is a man who spent his whole life rehearsing for exactly the moment he eventually faced. He called the practice premeditatio paupertatis, the premeditation of poverty. Periodically, deliberately, he stripped his life down. Rough clothes, minimal food, a few days at a time, living as the poorest man in Rome would live. Not because he had to. Because he needed to know, in his bones, that he could lose everything and still be a man worth respecting. Late in his life, Seneca wrote a long series of letters to a younger friend named Lucilius, and one theme runs through nearly all of them more than money ever does. Time. Seneca kept returning to the observation that men guard their money jealously, refuse to lend it, count it constantly, and yet hand over their days to anyone who asks, as if time were the one resource they had an endless supply of. He considered this the strangest blindness in Roman life. Men would fight over a disputed coin and, in the very same afternoon, waste hours they would never get back on something that meant nothing to them. Turn that observation on yourself for a moment. You know, to the dollar, roughly what you are worth financially right now. Could you say, with anything close to that precision, how you actually spent the last 30 days of your life? Most men cannot, and Seneca would tell you that gap is the real emergency, not the number in your account. Ask yourself the question he was really asking himself. If the number in your account went to zero tomorrow, would you still know who you are? If you hesitated, that hesitation is the real subject of this video. You do not need to fast for 3 days or sleep on a hard floor to practice a version of this today. The modern equivalent is simpler, and in some ways harder, because it asks for patience instead of a single dramatic gesture. It is choosing to live meaningfully below what you could technically afford, on purpose, for years, so that a bad quarter or a lost contract never has the power to take your identity down with your income. It is keeping a fund set aside specifically so you never have to make a decision out of fear. It is resisting the upgrade you could justify, not because you cannot afford it, but because you are training the same muscle Seneca was training in that plain, borrowed cloak. The muscle that knows, with total certainty, that it would survive losing all of it. If that question landed somewhere real, type "still me" in the comments. A reminder to yourself that your worth does not evaporate with your bank balance. Law 8. The craving was never about the number. Chasing money as proof of worth does not just fail to satisfy you. It cannot satisfy you. By design. Think of it like drinking salt water for thirst. The more you take in, the thirstier you become, because you were never solving the problem you thought you were solving. There is a pattern researchers who study happiness have noticed in people who suddenly acquire money. Their satisfaction jumps for a while, and then it quietly settles back down to roughly where it started, because the mind recalibrates to whatever it now has and starts measuring itself against the next thing up the ladder. Psychologists call this the process of adapting to a new baseline. The Stoics did not need a laboratory to notice it. They watched it happen to every wealthy man in Rome and gave it a simpler name. The appetite that cannot be filled, only fed. You thought one more raise would be enough. There is no enough waiting on the other side of more. There is a story, often told among people who study this pattern, about lottery winners who receive a life-changing sum of money and, within a handful of years, report being no happier than they were before the win. Some report being less happy, weighed down by new relationships built around their money, new pressure to manage it, new fear of losing it. The number solved nothing, because the number was never the actual problem. The mind simply built a new ceiling directly above the old floor, and kept looking upward exactly as it always had. You have almost certainly felt a smaller version of this yourself. The purchase you saved for and finally made, the one that felt like it would change everything, and then, within a matter of weeks, sat in your house like any other object, no longer capable of producing the feeling that convinced you to buy it in the first place. That fading is not a flaw in the product. It is the appetite doing exactly what it was always going to do. There is a second trap sitting quietly beside the first one, and it lives in your pocket. Open any app built to hold your attention, and within seconds you are looking at someone else's number, someone else's vacation, someone else's kitchen renovation, displayed like a trophy for an audience of strangers. You were not comparing yourself to your neighbor 100 years ago. You had no way to. Now you compare yourself, every single day, to the most curated, filtered, best possible version of thousands of people you will never meet. The Stoics never had to defend against that particular weapon, because it did not exist yet. You do. Every scroll is a small invitation to measure your unfinished life against someone else's highlight reel, and walk away feeling smaller for it. Law 9. Money is a tool, not an identity. So what is money, if not the scoreboard you were trained to believe it was? A tool. Nothing more, nothing less. A hammer does not define the man holding it. Neither does a number in an account. The Stoics used money without being ruled by it. Seneca had plenty of it. Marcus governed an empire's treasury. That is the entire discipline. Not rejection. Command. You do not need to give away what you have. You need to stop asking it to tell you who you are. Used correctly, money buys exactly one thing worth having, and it is not status. It is time. It is the ability to sit at that dinner table without checking the phone. It is choosing work that does not quietly erode you, because you built enough of a foundation that you are not one bad month away from disaster. It is walking away from a deal that felt wrong, because your sense of self was never wired into whether that particular deal closed. Every one of those is a use of money the Stoics would recognize immediately. None of them require a bigger number. Most of them require a smaller appetite. You already know what this looks like today, because you live inside it. The comparison at midnight, someone else's number lit up like a trophy on a screen. The purchase on credit that exists only to be seen. The exhausted hours chasing a raise while the people who love you forget what your undistracted attention feels like. Not because you wanted this life. Because somewhere along the way, you mistook the scoreboard for the game. Picture your own version of an ordinary Tuesday. The alarm that goes off before you are ready. The commute spent half listening to something about markets or crypto or which stock everyone else is quietly getting rich from. The meeting where a colleague mentions a bonus, and you spend the next hour doing math about your own worth instead of your own work. The evening where you finally sit down, and instead of resting, you open an app and scroll past a stranger's new car, a stranger's vacation, a stranger's kitchen, each one a small, silent verdict on your own life that you never asked for and cannot stop reading anyway. None of that is a character flaw. It is simply what an ordinary Tuesday looks like for a mind that has been trained, for years, to treat comparison as information. The Stoics would not tell you to disappear from that world. They would tell you to stop handing it a vote on who you are. The game was never about the number. It was about the man you become while chasing it. Law 10. Wealth is what you no longer need. Wealth is not what you accumulate. Wealth is what you no longer need. The richest man in the room is not the one with the biggest number. He is the one who could lose it tonight and wake up tomorrow exactly as certain of who he is. You have spent years building a number. Start spending the rest of your life building a man that number cannot define. This week, do the thing on this list that will feel most uncomfortable. Go one full day without a single purchase made to be seen by anyone else. Not one. Notice what surfaces when the usual distraction disappears. That itch is the wound this entire video has been pointing at. You are not trying to become poor. You are trying to prove, the way Seneca proved it to himself 2,000 years ago, that you can survive without the crutch. So it never again gets to hold your identity hostage. You came into this video thinking it was about money. It was never about money. It was about the quiet, unspoken deal you made years ago. That your worth would be measured in a number, instead of in the man you actually are when no one is counting. That deal is over today. Not because your bank account changed. Because you did. You do not need much. You need to know, without flinching, that you never did. Somewhere tonight, that man from the beginning of this video, the one with the car and the watch and the number that makes other men go quiet, is checking his phone again. He will likely keep checking it for the rest of his life, because nobody ever handed him these 10 laws. You have an advantage he does not have. You know, now, exactly where the anxiety was actually coming from. What you do with that knowledge starting tonight is the only part of this that was ever really up to you. If even one law in the last 40 minutes cut through, type my Stoic code in the comments below, and subscribe. Not for me. So that the next time your mind tries to sell you the old lie, you have a place to come back to, and remember who you actually are.